Day 16. Setting up YAML-based build and deployment pipelines in Azure DevOps by Jesper Mayntzhusen. This article will show you how you can set up YAML build and deployment pipelines for an Umbraco 8 site. It is intended for users who have several similar sites and want to be able to quickly and easily set up a professional CI/CD pipeline. Note, if you are completely unfamiliar with Azure DevOps pipelines, then this article may be too advanced. I'd recommend checking out Aaron Sadler's excellent 3-part series on scrift.io. Setting up a YAML build pipeline. First thing to do is add a yaml.yml file to your repo. In my repo, I will add a pipelines folder where I will store all my pipeline things, but you can place the files wherever you want. First off, I will add a build YAML file, which should handle building the artifact. Later, we will add a deploy YAML file as well, which will take the build artifact and deploy it to a server. So this initial file sets some of the configuration for the pipeline. We don't want it to trigger on PRs. If you need that, you can just remove the line entirely, as that is the default. We only want it to trigger on specific branches, in my case dev and main. We only want it to trigger when files from the source folder are changed, so no runs on e.g. git ignore or readme changes. This can either be an include or an exclude list, and will likely need to be amended as things are added. We want it to batch commits. This means if the build is running, and 3 new commits are made while it runs, we don't let it run 3 more times. Instead, we batch all 3 commits into one run. We set the name to be the date and the run number, so we will get build names like #build-20211112.3. Next, we set up our first stage, which is just a group of jobs run together, and determine the build agent and the first step, which checks out our site's Git repository. At this point, the build pipeline doesn't actually build anything, but the basics are there for us to start working on which steps we need to perform to get our build artifact. Determining build steps. If you think about how you start a site up locally from a repo, it is probably something like this. Clone the repo, open the solution, build the site in Visual Studio, navigate to your front-end folder and run npm install. While in the front-end folder, run npm run build. The site now runs. The YAML steps are basically the same, except we also need to ensure that things are installed. So our YAML file already has the checkout step. Let's add these steps. Open the solution, not really possible on a build VM. Build the site in Visual Studio. So to open and build the solution, we need to add these 3 new tasks. First, we need to install NuGet before we can use it. Then we restore all packages. This happens automatically in Visual Studio, but it has to be done specifically in the pipeline. Then finally, we use VS Build, which is a command line equivalent to building in Visual Studio. I've added some default config that we use. You can look them up if you're curious what each do. Next, we want to do the front-end steps. Navigate to your front-end folder and run npm install. While in the front-end folder, run npm run build. While the back-end build is fairly straightforward, since it just runs based on a solution file you specify, front-end can work in many different ways. In my example here, I will assume that there is a front-end folder in the root of the repository where we can run the npm commands. In PowerShell, you can run multiple commands at once by separating them with a semicolon. Since all tasks default to the root of the site, which is where the cloned repo goes, we can chain commands as shown above to ensure we run from the correct folder. Note, npm-ci is a more performant version of npm-i. So at this point, the pipeline file should do all the things that we need for the build. Final part for us is to save the build artifacts so we can deploy them. Saving the backend files as an artifact is quite easy, as the VS Build task automatically zips it up and places it wherever you specify in the /p:/package location parameter. So we add a publish build artifact task at the end. Our front-end build places all the front-end files in a specific folder, and we zip that up and save it as an artifact. But since the front-end builds can be so different, it may require other steps for you. The important part is to save all the files you need to place on the server. Here is an example of how it can be done. At this point, our file looks something like this. Assuming all paths and required files exist, this should work just fine. However, both npm and NuGet packages would currently be downloaded every time, so we could add some cache tasks, which would then check if e.g. package config has changed, and if not, it gets the packages from cache instead. There are some predefined jobs that handles all this for you. The docs have a nice list of common cases here. Creating the build pipeline in Azure DevOps. First of all, make sure you push your new pipeline to your repo before we start. Next, head to Azure DevOps, create a new project, and go to the Pipelines section where we can start setting up. Click the Create Pipeline button, select where your repo is stored. In my case, it will be GitHub YAML. Once you have found and selected your repo, make sure to select Existing Azure Pipelines YAML file. There you can find your YAML file and select it. It will ask you to review the YAML, and finally you can either run it or just save it. I recommend saving it, then pushing a small change to a file with the included paths to see if it triggers when it should. It gets a default name, which isn't that nice, but if you go back to the pipelines overview, you can rename it to something more fitting. I will call mine Build. Setting up a YAML deploy pipeline. If you're familiar with Azure DevOps for build pipelines using the classic editor, then it should all feel very familiar with the YAML steps. It is actually super quick to change since all jobs have a YAML definition you can see in the classic editor and copy over. However, when deploying, there are a few more differences. One of the big ones is deployments won't be under the releases section, but just another pipeline. Note, the example I will use here is for deploying to a VM. There should be jobs for Azure Web Apps and for containers as well, but it's not something I have worked with. Let's try to set it up. First of all, in the Pipelines folder, I will add a deploy YAML file. A few things are different here compared to the build. Here we will ignore the regular triggers like commits and PRs to the repo, and instead we include a resource, which is our build pipeline from earlier. That means we will only trigger this deploy pipeline when the build pipeline finishes. We then add a deploy stage which has an environment specified. If you've worked with deployment groups and release pipelines before, then these environments are very similar. The name is left blank for now, as we need to set it up in DevOps later. For the actual steps we need, we will use the Iis Manage and Iis Deploy Tasks. There are a lot of config options on these. If in doubt, look them up in the documentation. But what we basically do here is create or update an Iis website called test site. Set that website's path to f:/websites/test site. Set its domain to testsite.domain. Create or update the app pool for it called test site. Deploy our backend artifact to the test site Iis profile. Deploy our front-end artifact to the test site Iis profile. Setting up a deploy environment. The final piece missing for the deploy YAML file is to set the deploy target VM, which needs to be configured in DevOps first. So if you go to DevOps and click on the Environments tab, then Create Environment, then fill out a name. I will call mine Dev Server and select Virtual Machine. Finally, you get a PowerShell script you can copy. Now you want to open a remote connection to your server, open PowerShell in admin mode and paste the script in. Run through the wizard. I normally go with all default settings, and finally you should see it succeed and can now see the environment on the Environments tab in DevOps. Only thing left to do is add the name to the YAML file. In my case, the name is Dev Server. The final file will look something like this. You may be used to having an approval process for release pipelines in the non-YAML version. For YAML, it is not something you set per stage. Instead, you can set it per environment. You do so by going to the environment in DevOps, click on it, then find the options here. The final thing to do is to add a new pipeline for deploying. It is the exact same steps as above. Make sure your YAML file is pushed to the repo, go to the Pipeline section, click the New Pipeline button. Select where your repo is stored. In my case, it will be GitHub YAML. Once you have found and selected your repo, make sure to select Existing Azure Pipelines YAML file. Find your Deploy YAML file and select it. Rename it to something better. Mine will be Deploy. At this point, when you see it in your pipelines overview, you can push another change to trigger the build, and then see if the deploy gets triggered after. We have now successfully set up YAML pipelines for our site, and it will automatically build and deploy when you commit to one of the track branches. I hope this article has been helpful. Feel free to write me on Twitter at Jesper Mayntzhusen with any comments, questions or feedback.